We are in a Mazda CX5, current generation. The year on this one, is not listed, but I believe this is a 21. It has the revised lighting. It's kind of a refreshed version of the car. The reason I'm driving it today, this has been one of my go-to rental cars for quite some time, and my girlfriend needed to rent a car for her trip retreat. So I negotiated with the rental car company and got her a CX5, knowing that she was going to have to drive to Palm Desert and back. But it's a chance for me to reacquaint myself with the car, see if time has been kind to the car, see if the car was ahead of its time. Now with the CX5, something I've always told people is avoid the optional larger sized wheels. This tends to be a universal thing with Mazdas. The chassis on Mazdas are really lovely if you don't get the larger wheels. The larger wheels are clearly not an engineering decision. They're clearly a design decision, and you can feel that with this CX5 as well. I've corrected the tire pressures when we picked up the car, so that is not the issue. But what you find is the car is constantly moving and fidgeting on these larger wheels. So my recommendation to you and to anyone else with these cars is stick with the standard wheel sizing. Choose the car based around that. I like the most optioned up CX5 I can get without having to get the larger wheel size. And if you do end up with the larger wheel size, find someone willing to trade your larger wheels for their smaller ones, and you'll end up with a much nicer car overall. You can see, like, it's an easy car to move around in, and by that I mean it's very intuitive. I just hop in. There aren't any sudden movements with the steering, with the throttle. The transmission is quite intuitive. I was thinking about half a second before it downshifted. It'd be nice if we were in a gear lower, and sure enough, the transmission does that. So this is something that Mazda really worked hard on developing with this particular car. They wanted to make it an intuitive car to drive, a fatigue-free car to drive, and they really aced it. And I think that's what took the CX5 to the next level. This feels, as you're driving it, you forget you're in a Mazda. You think of cars, honestly, like if Porsche was foolish enough to do a transverse engine front driver, it would end up feeling something like this. This, to me, there's a resolution and an integration to this car that you wouldn't find from recent BMWs. You wouldn't find from pretty much anything else. I mean, Mazda really works harder on the small stuff than most everyone else these days. And if you haven't driven a Mazda recently, if your memories of Mazda are from the Ford-owned, here's some parts, do your best, good luck era, if that's your impression of Mazda, you do yourself a disservice by thinking that's what Mazda is. Today's Mazda, I've been saying for a while now, and I was anticipating for even longer. If you were alive and licensed and driving in the 90s with cars like the 626 and the MX6 and the Millennia, that original Miata, NANB, RX-7, we're talking pre-RX-8, we're talking pre-NC Miata, we're talking pre even guess the decline, you'd say, when Ford got a little too involved. But today's Mazda, in the way it's constructed, in the way that the touch points of the car, the materials of the car, is approximating that Amati run for the luxury segment that was stillborn and thwarted. And you really can feel that in every aspect of the car. The only thing holding the Millennia back in the day was, I would say, powertrain and to some extent the transverse front drive platform. So what we're all anticipating with the CX90's new platform, with the longitudinal platform, the inline 6, is Mazda is finally uninhibited, freed from the constraints of this type of a platform. And instead of cornering as well as you can expect from a front driver, you get the true kind of 50-50 old school BMW handling balance, and you get a sense of the car not trying to fight the physics, but instead flowing because of the physics. And that is something I really look forward to sampling. I do suspect two issues, though, with this new model lineup. The first is they're starting with crossovers and SUVs, right? So although it is now set up properly, you might say, the physical constraint is not so much the engine layout and drivetrain layout. The physical constraint is we've got a big and heavy SUV that sits high. So physics, again, working against it in that way. And the second is there's a sense that Mazda's trying to do things on the cheap recently. I first experienced this with the CX5. Anyone who tells you the CX5 is some remarkable driving machine really needs to drive more machines and really understand what remarkable means, because you can tell with the CX5 that unlike the CX5, unlike the CX30 even, unlike the 3, there are things left unfinished. There are things that have been rushed. And I would say the CX5 does a good approximation of something like a Ford Explorer or a Subaru Outback, where those companies know that their buyers aren't so persnickety, aren't expecting much, and are shopping based on size, based on features. Whereas something like the CX5 is the opposite of that, right? This is for a buyer who really is looking for refinement, and this is for a buyer who really knows how to shop and what to look for. This is for a buyer who isn't shopping by size. This is for a buyer who's shopping by quality and integrity, driving experience, ownership experience, refinement. Well, without these wheels, refinement, right? So I hope this gives you a better sense of what a CX5 is. I think it's one of those cars that we reset the mileage meter. It's averaging over 30 miles a gallon, 32 miles a gallon. It's just a really likable car, and I feel like the people who end up getting one, a lot of times they're getting them almost by accident. They end up getting them because they're like, oh, it looks cute, or oh, it's not too big, I like the size. What are the downsides of this car? Well, the downsides, I would say, Mazda has a design language that kind of debuted with this car called Kodo. Actually, I wouldn't say it debuted with this car, but más o menos. Kodo dictates some of the strengths of this car, which is its attractive appearance, its upscale appearance, but also its weaknesses, which is the packaging. It's not a roomy car. Then again, it's not that large a car. My frustration, I would say, is I know that some people just haven't gelled with the car because it feels a little bit confining, but that's intentional on their part. They're trying to make a very like Miata-like cockpit feel. So this door panel kind of hugs in. The transmission tunnel cuts in quite a bit. You don't get that sense of panoramic visibility. I wouldn't say the visibility is bad whatsoever. You know, generous mirror sizes. The view backwards is pretty unconstrained. But, you know, this stuff feels a bit bulky compared to some others. And I think that gives the car a sense of being boxed in, especially in the day of electrified vehicles where interior spaces have kind of been restructured, reimagined in a sense, and opened up because of the liberties that those platforms allow. But you know, a 997 Porsche 911 just pulled next to me, and there's a surprising lot in common between these two cars. Not on paper whatsoever, but in the way the engineers sweat details and in the way the controls work with you. Even the little icon here for D is done in a more artful way than you'll find from other vehicles. It's little things like this that make a car like this so satisfying compared to something like that Tesla Model Y, which has literally one trick, and that trick is what that driver just did, which is accelerate sharply off the line. This car has dozens and dozens of little strengths that add up to a really pleasant driving experience and really pleasant ownership experience. So if you're in the market for any type of car, I would put a CX5 on the list. If you're in the market for a crossover, especially a two-row crossover, I would absolutely put the CX5 at the top of your list. I've driven everything in the category, I've driven everything in other categories, and honestly, if I was spending my money, this is almost a no-brainer compared to most everything else. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that was a good share for you. If you're interested in these cars, obviously you would be if you are watching this video and listening to me go on and on about the car's virtues and its very few characteristics that might not be seen as virtues. One last note: octane. This car does benefit from higher octanes. The drivability improves. Give that a try. Oh, and related to that, I tend to prefer the naturally aspirated four-cylinder, not the turbo. There's an assumption, I think, among people that the turbo is better. The turbo, I think, has a better home in something like a CX9, where there was a lot of mass to move, but the power here is entirely adequate for something like this. You don't really want to be hustling. Not that you can't or I haven't, but for the way that these cars tend to be used, you can gather plenty of speed without even exceeding 4,000 RPM or more than, say, half throttle with this motor, because Mazda, with this motor, being that it's a 2.5 liter, with its compression, with its stroke, it does have an emphasis on torque. So it's a pretty satisfying motor. I'm not a four-cylinder fan per se, but I'm even less of a four-cylinder turbo fan. I do like the way Mazda has set up that four-cylinder turbo. It's not really a complaint about that particular engine so much. It's just, I think that the car as a package was born with this motor, and you can feel that the other motor was transplanted in. So, boring driving, I know, but I hope that the commentary at least gives you a sense of what this car has on offer. And if you have any comments or questions, drop them in below and we can discuss. Drive safe out there.